Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now I know because you tell me that lots of you listen while you're doing something else. So hello to anyone cleaning, walking the dog, driving, cooking, going for a run, or doing anything else but just sitting there and listening. This episode is for you. Because on today's show, I'm exploring the idea of tuning out. In other words, not paying full attention. In today's hectic world where we're bombarded with opinions, distractions, and data, we have to choose what we pay attention to, which is why I'm tremendously grateful that you've made the effort to download the show and allowed me into your ears. Thank you. My guest is Nuala Walsh. To call her a behavioural scientist would be correct, but I'd be missing a whole host of other attributes and careers that she has. So rather than me introducing her, I'm going to let her do it on the show. What you do need to know before we start is that Nuala is the author of a brand new book called Tune In: How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World, which is all about how we can make sure that the opinions and information we pay attention to is the kind that'll help us to make better decisions. As you'll hear, and as Nuala illustrates through lots of examples in her book and on the show, we often have access to brilliant information that would really help us to make better decisions. If only we could tune into that and tune out of some of the useless information that drives us to make bad ones. In our discussion, we explore Nuala's career, how she came to write the book, and some of the lessons we can learn if we want to make better decisions. So whatever else you're doing while you've got the show on in the background, this is someone you're going to want to listen to on a subject you're going to want to hear. It's my discussion with Nuala Walsh on Tuning In. Nuala, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you very much, Christian. Great to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you here because you're one of the people that is involved in lots of things that I'm involved in, and you've had an absolutely fascinating career. And I think hearing a little bit about that will help us to understand your book as well. So can you just give my listeners a little sort of potted history of you and what you do?
Sure. Well, you're right. I guess I do wear many hats. But going back, maybe, I suppose it's a good question. How do you define yourself? I've changed direction so many times. Sometimes I do wonder about that. But I guess I started my career in consulting, and that was a phenomenal start, if you like, because it started the breadth of exposure to a lot of different industries, markets, clients, etc. And it sort of took off from there. I spent about 3 decades, if you look at it now, in global investment management and investment banking, and I worked for BlackRock, Merrill Lynch, and latterly as CMO with Standard Life. And I guess really about 5 years ago, I changed direction, if you like, and I went back to school. I went back to do a master's in behavioural science at the London School of Economics. Now, just to put that into context, I always loved the psychology of behaviour. When I graduated, I actually did 2 years studying forensic psychology, which you see how this all comes full circle. And so, but I absolutely loved it. I loved trying to analyze not just normal behavior, but deviant behavior. And as I embarked on my 30-year career, I realized that actually maybe there were too many more similarities than one would have thought. So my interest in criminology continued. And then 5 years ago, as I said, I set up my own business as a consultant using behavioral science. But I guess I have to consider that when you asked earlier on about the many different things I've done, before I left corporate life, I wanted something a little bit different. So I started a board career, and I started with UN Women and ActionAid. And the ActionAid actually plays to some time that I had spent many, many years ago, my consulting career. I spent a year with the World Bank in Africa. So that third world development theme also plays through. And I guess what you will see in the book and throughout my career is that everything is a springboard to something else. So today, I wear multiple hats, as I said. I sit on a number of boards in sport because during those 30 years as a corporate, I sponsored a number of different events, fabulous events, like the British and Irish Lions, the Ryder Cup. Spent a couple of years on the tennis tour with McEnroe and Borg. And today I work with World Athletics, done that for the last nearly a decade, Basketball Ireland, the Football Association, and I sit on the board of the British and Irish Lions. So there's also a sports team that comes through. I also chair the Innocence Project, which is just phenomenal. And even yesterday, we had the Alabama's first death penalty execution. So this whole theme of, that wasn't a wrongful conviction, but the whole theme of wrongful convictions really, I think, plays through. And again, that's a theme that comes through in the book. So you see that my background comes through in spades. I also like to write. So today, I consider that a hobby, actually. So I write about decision making. I write about misjudgment. I write about unethical decision making and misconduct. And I do that for Inc., for Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and now this book. So a number of different hats. And I actually think I've probably forgotten a few. I've forgotten also that I work with the Harvard Club of Ireland, where I give lectures regularly. I'm now a fellow of the London School of Economics. I'm going to be doing some work with Trinity College Dublin as well. So in short, 3 strands: academic, consulting, and board.
Wow. And of course, as I said to you before we started recording, this isn't a job interview, so we don't need to have the order or the dates or the full details there. This is more just to get a sense, because I think, what you've talked about there, and my sense in all the conversations you and I have had before, is that there's a sense of curiosity about what makes people do what they do. And that seems to me to flow through. And if we look at your interests, there is that clear passion for humans and why we do the things that we do. And so when you talk about it, it's almost natural in a way that you would want to write about the subject that you chose to write about.
You're absolutely right. And as I went through the stories, arguably I could have culled some. I didn't. It's jam-packed with stories. And all of them play to something that means something to me in some way. I really wanted to talk about some of the serial killers, actually, and the impact and the judgments all around, not just from the individuals, but from the people who investigated, the people on the juries, the judges in the different cases. It didn't matter what I talked about: mergers, because I'd been through several. I talked about presidents because I had encountered some in my life. I talked about astronauts because I'd been lucky enough to meet them. So everything in the book has a connection to some part of my life. So it isn't an autobiographical book at all, but the strand is definitely there. Mistakes people have made in areas that I'm familiar with. And I think for me, that makes it slightly personal, but there's a little bit of reveal, but nothing major. And that makes it real. And maybe if I give an example, the opening of the book, if you remember, is about the greatest voice of all time who didn't hear the voices that really mattered. And I talked about Elvis Presley. And again, you might say, well, he's a bit old news at this stage. Well, yes and no, but I grew up listening to that music. 30, 40 years ago, my husband and I went to Graceland on one of those Delta Pass tours. And, I never forgot it. I wasn't a particular, rock and roll fan at all, but we were all interested in the story. And I opened the book with that story, and I was in danger of almost writing a biography. I read about 5 books to write that introduction. And before I closed the book, before I sent it off to print, I went back with my husband just a couple of months ago and went through those same greats of Graceland, because I wanted to put his story, the voices that he didn't listen to, and all the mistakes he made into context. And it's almost, as I said, life come full circle. I actually did feel, 30, 40 years ago past, the decisions I've made, the decisions other people have made, you gain that perspective, you gain a very different view on life. And it was, for me, it was a nice wrap up. And, it was certainly relevant to the introduction, but it opened the story, and it opened this whole theme of how we don't listen to the voices that really matter. We think we do. We're full of bias, and sometimes we're overconfident in that we do. But practically, for a million different reasons, we don't, even when we have all the tools, and in his case, all the talent, all the money available to him to go on the right path. And that story replicates throughout the book, of the people who didn't, people who are privileged, people who aren't privileged, but we all have the opportunity to hear differently. It doesn't cost you any money to listen. And the book is not about listening. It's about reinterpreting what you hear. Anyone can arguably hear, but it's that when it matters, the ability to go beyond the obvious and to probe deeply so that you don't miss the signals, you don't miss the cue, you don't rush to judgment because these voices are familiar or comfortable or convenient, that you do go that extra mile. And that's why I feel so strongly about the theme of the book and what I call deaf spots rather than blind spots, because in today's world, we are tuned out. There is evidence of tone deaf leadership every day. And when you hold power, I think it really, really matters. And you have a moral responsibility to listen better, listen differently, and reinterpret what you hear rather than make these rush to judgment, which is too easy in a noisy world. But anyway, that's one example of how I brought a theme of something that, had some kind of personal resonance through the book. And I wanted to tell those stories. And I actually probably enjoyed writing that introduction. There are two parts I loved writing. I absolutely loved writing that. And I could have written the whole book on that one theme alone. And maybe in a future life, I learned that I also used people's people's stories. I read more autobiographies writing the book than I had in a very, very long time, certainly through my corporate career, probably because I didn't have time. And my favourite hobby is reading people's books. I've just finished Matthew Perry, actually. Again, fascinating. Sinead O'Connor comes through in the book because I was reading that.
Right.
And I thought, wow, I really want to bring this in here somewhere, because she was a fantastic example of someone who did listen, did get the signals right, but people tuned out of her.
And I loved that. I thought the opening was incredibly powerful, actually. And it was one of those, it's a well-known construct where you sort of tell a story. And of course, as you start telling it, I'm thinking, this is going to be about someone famous. This is going to turn. And then I'm thinking, I think I know who this is. And then you get the point. But I love the fact that you picked him as an example, because I think it's a really good illustration of traps that lots of leaders fall into. But it's a lovely example of someone who fought against the odds, had a talent, fought against the odds, got to be very successful, and was a decent individual from the story you tell, but was blinded by a whole load of the factors. Sort of almost, if you looked at it for the average person, had everything, and then fell foul of these things and ended the way that it did. And so I really liked the fact that you found a story that resonated for you, because I think one of the things that comes across in the book as a whole are the stories, the influence that stories have on us. And so I like the fact that, one, you've chosen to do lots of stories, and most of the stories, as you say, are I was complimenting you before we started recording that you've managed to keep them incredibly short. The temptation when one puts stories in is to tell lots of bits. So we have this lovely, more in-depth Elvis story, because that's relevant to you and is almost a sort of gateway to the whole process. And then lots of other little stories. So I love the fact that you pulled all these out. I mean, it's made for, I think, one of the longest indexes or indices I've ever seen at the back of this type of book. But that's to your credit, because you really do pull these things out. So you draw us in with this initial tale of Elvis, and then we go all over the place with a range of things. How did you pick the stories that you chose? Because you must have had a heck of a long list of them that you could have used.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I was never stuck for stories, Christian. Never. What happened was I started writing. I didn't start with the stories. I started with the problem, if you like. And then the stories just came. I got them everywhere I went. And you probably see that the book is quite current, because I brought in Sam Bankman-Fried. I actually had Elizabeth Holmes in it already. And then the court case came out. I brought in recent examples deliberately, but also historical examples. It was hard to structure. I went on, this is a story that really moved me. And if it moves me, it probably moves other people. And the stories were so powerful. I think they were human stories in many cases. And I could have written 3 more books with the stories. I had to get rid of quite a few. And I think because, I didn't want an even longer index. And I was obviously watching the length of the book as well. And I also wanted each chapter to be around the same length, because I wanted it to be almost a pick and mix. If you had a problem with chasing power, or with curating identity, or with, the voice of ethics and temptation, I wanted people to be able to dip into these particular chapters and have stories that they would remember. Because once upon a time, a long time ago, when we were, when I was making presentations in business, there was a great tip I got, and it was called the star. I think it came from an English politician, and it was always leave people with a star, STAR, something they will always remember, or they'll always remember. And that sort of guided the stories, which is the essence of stories. Is there something in this story? And the stories had to be relevant, not just to the theme, but did they tuned out? So I had to do a bit of a test and get rid of some. Did they tune out, or did they tune in? So everyone either tuned out or tuned in, and what voice? And then I started analysing, all the different range of voices that you could tune into and out of. And it was a pretty long list. So each chapter, ironically, plays to the voice of conscience, or the voice of comfort, or the voice of familiarity, or the voice of ethics, or the voice of ego, vanity, sanity. It's a very long list, but that is sort of my discipline. Do they tune in? Do they tune out? And what voice can I attribute it to? So it might have been good or evil, or or whatever. There are plenty of them, but it had to play to a voice, and that was sort of my test for whether the story stayed in or not. And as you say, a lot of those stories, each story could have been a book. I mean, the story in stories, I gave the example of Rwanda, and I get that's a phenomenal story as well, and it's real. And I could have picked any examples where genocide took place, but again, it was a slightly different one, and I had read about it a long time ago, and it always stuck with me. So finding stories is never your problem in a book, I don't think. I think matching it to your theme and your core message, which is, listen to the signals, tune in properly, don't tune out when it matters, because there are consequences, always had to be the sense test at the end of it, I think.
Love that. And we've mentioned a few times the concept of tuning in. And of course, I haven't mentioned the title of the book yet, which is Tune In: How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World. And I really like that image of tuning in, because what that neatly transmits is the idea that actually, to make good decisions, the information that we need is actually there.
Yeah.
We just have to make sure that we pick it up. And so I love this idea. Given the age I am, I was thinking of a radio dial. And as I was trying to sort of think back to the old AM days, for listeners that remember that, of really trying to tweak the signal so you could pick up the strongest possible signal to hear it. And so you're not saying to people, you need to go out and do something fundamentally different, right? The information is there, but it's really a question of processing the right bits and not focusing on things that we shouldn't focus on the things that we should. And so I love this idea of tuning in. I thought was great, because that, one, it's correct, but two, is it's eminently actionable. And so you've honed in on something that doesn't say you've got this all wrong, you need to fundamentally change it. Of course we have on some level, but this is highly actionable, because what you're saying, I think, is pay attention to certain things that we're paying too much attention to, stuff we shouldn't pay attention to at all, and then there's some things that we're ignoring. And so if we can recognize what those dynamics are, we can tune into the stuff that really matters, and that's how we make better decisions. In other words, the challenge of human decision making, if I sort of summarize it, is a data problem, in that we can't change the operating system that we come with. But what we can do is be careful about the data that goes into that operating system, and that's how we influence our decision making.
That's a great point. I wish I had you summarize my book, Christian. That's a great point. And what you point to is there are too many voices. There's too much information, and it's about being more selective. And so sometimes as a leader, you're told you must listen to everybody. You must hear all the data. You must hear all the facts, and that's part of inclusion as well. But the truth is, you can't listen to every voice. And one point I make in the book is all voices are not equal all the time. And, as a leader, it's like, well, I have to listen to everyone. You don't, because the problem is, if you listen to everyone, you end up hearing nothing, because there's too much noise and you just can't filter. So it's about selectively tuning in. And of the key words that I try to use, you selectively tune in and, to the voices. And the only way to do that is exactly as you say, it's to slow down. And I brought in a concept called decision friction. Now, friction, as we know, in the online world is a real problem, because, friction it isn't it's unwelcome. It's that awkward way where you can't get out of an online subscription. But when it comes to thinking, it is welcome, because it's like a speed bump for the mind. It slows you down long enough to overcome what I've called the perimeters trap. Whether it's power or ego or risk or whatever. And you only need to do it temporarily, just long enough to stop that rush to judgment, to stop that system one thinking, so that you can at least filter those derailing voices, particularly when you're in a hot state, under stress, uncertainty, unsure, any of these circumstances that make us make mistakes. So I put in 18. I could have put in 180 ways to do this. In the last chapter, or that section rather, which plays to this need to reflect and need to reinterpret and need to reappraise more. But the problem starts earlier. The problem is we don't reflect because we don't want to reflect. We think we're already really good decision makers. I mean, we've read all the overconfidence studies. I think Accenture did a study. 96% of people rate themselves as above average listeners. And then there was another study done by Merrick that said over 15 years that said, well, actually, leaders compared to their peers, 85% of peers disagreed with the leader's self-assessment of their decision-making ability. So it's that whole thing of, if you don't think you have a problem and you think you're a great listener, well, why are you going to stop? Enter misjudgment. So it's a real, never mind how biased we are. You don't think you're biased. Oh, okay. Well, therefore, I'm not even going to consider these misjudgment traps. And then even if you really want to listen, Christian, and want to listen to someone, we're paid to listen, therapists, consultants, etc. 80% of salaries are attributed to people's ability to listen. Practically, from a mental cognitive processing perspective, we're limited from processing speed. I think one researcher points out that you can only listen at 25% efficiency, even if you want to. So you can see the problem, and I guess that's why this filtering really matters.
And I love the fact that you started out by talking a lot about speed. And it was when you laid it bare that I suddenly thought, oh my, she's right. And we all know that intuitively everything is, it feels like the world is rushing a bit more than it used to. But you pinpointed lots of examples where we're talking about people breaking records, or speed of the internet, or our rapid need to respond to things. And so this idea that we need to be quicker, we need to make decisions quicker, things need to happen much more quickly, is making what is already a challenging. I mean, we're perfectly capable of screwing things up in a slower world. We've seen that, hence some of the examples you've picked are from way back when, but still relevant today. But this idea of the world is moving very, very quickly and lots of noise, I thought was incredibly obvious and yet incredibly powerful. And we sometimes sort of think that speed must be a good thing. That getting things done quickly, that quickly equals efficiency, plays into all these things. And actually, as we know from things like slow cooking, actually, sometimes things can be delightful and much more effective if they're slower. But I love the fact that you highlighted, I thought I'd thought about it, but actually you picked so many examples of things where, speed is of the essence. And actually that doesn't help us at all.
You're absolutely right. And actually, there's some great studies done by Harvard. And I put in the book that we're rewarded for speed. A fast decision maker you don't need to be an accurate decision maker, actually has a I think it was 12 times higher probability of reaching CEO. So that is actually scary. I'm a quick decision maker. Whoa, and your client pays you to listen and deliberate, but actually, and then they say, okay, well, can you give me the answer tomorrow? We know this. So it's a real problem in terms of, our ability and the systems around us that actually reward quick decision making. It doesn't make for better judgment. And it is a problem. And then, we know that faulty decision making costs companies millions. I mean, I think I saw something somewhere where it costs the average Fortune 500 company, it costs them around 250 million a year. And that's one study of one particular group. You can imagine the reputation damage and unethical costs and human damage that it costs other companies, and non-calculable. And we've seen that from some of the travesties. I mean, you've had on your previous podcast, the Grenfell Tower example, and I put that in the book because, again, it was so powerful, of the misjudgment, the voice of greed, and other voices that you could have pointed to in that case, convenience and everything else, over good judgment, over doing the right thing. So speed, when it comes to good judgment, there is a school of thought that says, well, intuition is great and we have to rely on intuition. Yes, but yes, with a caveat. You can have your intuition, but then you can back it up and reflect on it and check it and calibrate it with other people, etc., and test it. But it's from confirmation bias. We know that people just don't do that. And it has been, we've seen in the Space Challenger, there are too many examples of where that goes wrong. I mean, one example of intuition of where that I did use, where some people used it and some groups didn't, but were pilots. So if you compare the pilot who, for example, chartered the flight with Kobe Bryant, he used his intuition, like he saw the fog and decided, well, it'll be okay. Well, intuition and experience, it wasn't, and that was flawed. Other factors came into play there about impression management and, trying to please the client. And we saw what happened there. Compare that to Charles Sullenberger, who landed on the Hudson, safely saving, hundreds of passengers. Again, he used his intuition, experience and judgment in a moment of panic, and that saved lives. So your point about so we can't be completely binary and say, a rush to judgment. Sometimes it works, but when it really, really matters, in the moment, you might have to just rely on that. But when you have the luxury of time, and in most cases, senior people do have some time available, people just don't do it. They use that spare time to fill in the gaps. And the internet's very generous, it allows you to make sense of absolutely anything. Some people, do think Elvis is still alive and, will use everything available to prove that, or that the moon landing was a hoax, or any other conspiracy that comes to mind. So there is something in that about judgment and the speed versus intuition debate.
And I love the fact that as you were talking about it, I sort of think, well, we have this capability to make quick decisions, right? Which has kept the species alive, undeniably. And that gets us out of all sorts of trouble. But just because we have it to use in those situations doesn't mean that it's a good idea to deploy it all of the time. And so often I think back to stories, the stories that get cited are, brilliant intuitive moments where somebody in a flash of, the Hudson landing is a great example. Right, he just uses his intuition. He knows what he's doing, and he saves loads of lives. Lovely story. Therefore, intuition's a good thing.
Yeah.
And I'd always, as I read the book, I often thought, well, it's what we have as a sort of backup system for when we have no other choice but to go on intuition. That's great, right? It will do something. Won't always get it right, but generally speaking, as a species, it seems to serve us fairly well. But I love this idea. It's part of the toolkit, and we can do other things, but we choose to sometimes rely on that because these stories of intuition must be a good thing. And so I love the fact that, in any other context, you wouldn't rely on an emergency thing for your main process. The emergency thing is there for emergencies in certain situations. And so I thought that was a really, really interesting way of highlighting, yes, of course we've got it. Yes, of course we sometimes need to use it, but that doesn't mean we need to use it all the time.
Do you know, and you reminded me, when it goes wrong, it goes wrong. Look at court cases and juries. Fantastic research shows, I mean, and how juries think about how they decide and how they don't change their mind. The majority of jurors do not change their mind. And cases can go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so despite all the evidence, guilty or innocent, all of the case, the prosecution case and the defense. So no matter what they hear, all the graphic images, all the stories, all the evidence, most of them don't change their mind. So the studies have shown, what did you think originally? How did you vote? And that is scary, Christian. When you look at, and when you correlate that back to the wrongful conviction, the number of people who are in prison who should not be, add that to the, evidence planting, et cetera, juries need to recalibrate, rethink, what did I really hear? When I'm being spun a story, and of course, the courtroom is a marvelous place for people to spin stories. That the best storyteller wins in a courtroom. But you're right, that using your intuition, because but again, they're rushing to judgment, aren't they? They look at the person in the dock and they decide, aha. And again, that's first impressions, that's beauty bias, and again, so many cases hang on first impressions. And there is an underlying theme in the book that one of the reasons why we get this wrong so often is this rush to judgment by relying on what we see rather than what we hear. And there are several reasons for that, of course. It's physics, it's neuroscience, it's education. We decide based on visual data rather than what we actually hear. And that stops us listening as well as we should. That stops us probing and reinterpreting what people tell you for 100 different reasons.
And reading the bits about juries really resonated with me, because a few years ago I did jury service, and I'll talk about this on a Chatham House rule basis to avoid causing any problems for myself. But doing the case, and it was fascinating because they give you no training whatsoever in this sort of stuff. And so you turn up in the courtroom, and I remember when we finished hearing all of the a couple of days worth of listening, and we sat in the room together deliberating, and one of the people just said, "Well, I know what I think, and I'm not going to change my mind." And I remember that rattled me. And I just said, well, what's the point in you being here if you've already decided we should be having a discussion? And of course, guess who the first person to change their mind was? That individual. But it really intrigued me that in something that's this important, we should actually, I think about training people. Now, I know there's all sorts of risks associated with that, which is we want people to come at this fresh. There's a reason we pull people off effectively off the street to do this, because we don't want people biased. We exclude people. But actually, this idea of teaching people decision making, the purpose of your
Mm.
book, it seemed to me that's a really good example
Mm.
of where this is so important. And we can so easily fall foul to these things. And to be clear, I'm not sitting there in a position of sort of sanctimoniously saying, well, obviously I was a much better decision maker. It was just laid stark to me. And I think because I'm interested in behavioral science, I was kind of in the process and also paying attention to how the process was playing out. So observing and participating. But it really struck me. And in those examples that you've talked about, it matters all the time, but it really matters when the consequences of a certain decision are life changing for people. And so it really struck me that that's a really good illustration of something where, I hesitate to say, but anybody going on jury duty would do well to take this book in with them, because you are going to be sitting around for a period of time before you're allocated, and just think about what you're there to do. Because I think that's a really good illustration of if it goes wrong, it has huge consequences. And I just, it's almost intriguing to me why this stuff isn't taught to people. This should be part of our education.
Well, that's another huge theme, and outtake in the book as well. In actual fact, I had gone through there's a girl, a woman, Hazel Thornton, who had sat on the Menendez jury trial, and she had talked about the whole experience. She documented, and very rare that you get a juror's view on what happens. And she makes exactly that point. And further to that, Christian, there's a point about when the judge gives juries instructions, research finds that actually they don't understand a lot of it, and that's not due to that's. I mean, the judge tries to make it as simple as possible, but they're listening to something that's kind of difficult. So it's no judgment on the type of people who are listening to it. It'd be pretty hard for anyone to exactly what does this mean? Does X mean Y? And interestingly, there was a difference found between whether the judge spoke the instructions or they were written. And kind of just echoing back to the people find it easier to rely on the visual on the written. They found it easier to understand when it was written rather than oral. But anyway, I think that's something that again is just worth thinking about.
And I want to pick you said something earlier about the prevalence of the visual. And I love that in the book you've taken this phrase that Daniel Kahneman mentions in Thinking Fast and Slow, which is the snappily titled Wizziati, what you see is all there is. And I'd never thought about this. I'd kind of implicitly, I recognized there were other senses there, but you dissect that bit and say, actually, it's not just about seeing, and this preference for seeing and the primacy of the visual is actually incredibly dangerous. And so you come in and say, actually, there's more to it than that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I love the fact that you were taking something, and ironically, I hadn't, pun fully intended, seen all of the bits that you pulled out. You suddenly made me think, oh, that's actually right. There is more to it. So what you see is all there is a dangerous framing, because it's not just about what you see.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. And I and even then, I related it to I called it the trilogy of error, blind spots, deaf spots, and dumb spots, which reminded me of the 16th century Japanese maxim, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And, maybe I draw too many parallels where there aren't any. But I sort of thought that, well, blind spots are the inability to see a problem, deaf spots are the inability to hear accurately, and dumb spots are the inability to speak. And that kind of reminded me of speaking up or not speaking up, which I had done my whistleblowing research on. And each of these problems cause us to misjudge what we hear, what we see, and what we say. And that is exactly aligned to Kahneman's, what you see is all there is, which he actually meant what you see is not all there is of course, what he meant. And so in the same way I went,
right.
Well, that's what he meant. What you hear is not all there is. And what you say is not all there is, because people speak in forked tongues, and, we know about the misinterpretation problems. So I really liked that analogy, and I called it the trilogy of error. And I was trying to say, well, people, if you think in 3D, am I at risk of a blind spot? Now, I know they meant it metaphorically speaking, but actually, if you think in 3D, and if you think it is a trilogy of error, blind spots, deaf spots, and dumb spots, I think it's a really neat way to think about how we make mistakes. And then I did do some research, and deaf spots are not all that common, but they do exist. There was a psychoanalyst, Eckstein, who had gone back to 1969, and he'd used this in a way to analyze human behavior and help therapists to make better decisions with their patients. But it's a good way, and the concept of deaf spot actually relates very neatly to something that does exist called deaf ear syndrome, which is tuning out what you don't want to hear. very closely related to the ostrich effect, as we know, and excessive denial of what doesn't suit us or make us comfortable or happy, and inattentional deafness, which is a cousin of inattentional blindness. So all of this is very much rooted in science. So I wanted to show that it had very strong scientific underpin, but you could try and make it more accessible to people by just thinking about it in this other way. And I did like that Japanese maxim. I think most people have on their desk or somewhere in my house. I must have had the three wise monkeys. People called it, but I had a picture of it somewhere, so it stuck in my mind. And I started to make that analogy. But in the book, as you say, you can't major on every theme because then it becomes you've got too many strands going through it. But it was certainly one that I did want to pull out. And if people took that away as something useful, I think it would be really, really helpful that they think in 3D, not in 1D, as in I'm so tunnel visioned and narrow focused, or 2D, which is binary. We're so binary, black, white, male, female, right, wrong, good, evil. We do it all the time. And again, in the book, I talk about that there is that is a problem for decision making when you only have that binary view, 1D or 2D, but thinking about in totality, not just what you hear, but what you see, what you hear, and what you don't hear, which of course is what people, either don't speak up. And there's another book could be written about speaking up or not speaking up. But it is important to think about what you hear as well as what you don't hear. Because you might hear something, but actually mishear it, which means, therefore, please, reinterpret. But then what you don't hear, as we know, is incredibly important as well. And I think there are some famous quotes about what people don't hear matters as much. I have to remember it. I think it was Peter Drucker. It was the most important thing in communication is hearing what isn't said. So
Right.
so although I think someone else says, I think someone says most people never listen anyway, according to Ernest Hemingway. But you can find lots of quotes around these things, but they're relevant, and they're relevant to the message of the book.
But it's interesting because I think as you were talking about, politicians, we are used to them giving sort of weaselly answers, and we have ignoring biased media, but well, even then, actually, they'll pluck the bit. But if we have a sort of forensic analysis of what it said, you can see journalists saying, well, notice they haven't said this,
Yes.
or that was a half answer, or they've missed this point. And so we know in that context that we need to pay close attention to what politicians are saying, how they're saying it. And of course, when they don't answer questions, that tells you something, what's missing from all that kind of stuff. But we have journalists that help us do that. So if I look at Prime Minister's questions in the UK, there's a lot of analysis about what wasn't said in the response and how the response, or was the question completely ignored, and that tells us something. And so I think that's a really good illustration of, in that specific context, we have constructs that are helpfully there because we have a free, relatively free media that can do that for us. But of course, you don't have that sitting in a meeting room or when you're chatting to someone else or when you're watching television. And so I think we need to think about bringing these things in. And so a lot of the things you're talking about, there are certain contexts in which we can see that working effectively. That analysis exists. Sports would be another great example, actually, where there's a lot of analysis of what managers are saying in press conferences and the interactions. So it's a case, I think, of taking some of those constructs that we have seen designed for other purposes and saying, well, how maybe we can apply that to what we do. And so a lot of the things you were saying, I thought really, as I looked at it, I thought, well, these are not, what you're suggesting isn't unusual. It just exists in certain contexts. It possibly doesn't exist when we need it most, which is in situations we're involved in, not necessarily observing other people.
And you're absolutely right. And it's for therapists as well. You point to journalists, which I think is great. And, there's some fantastic example of journalists who have just honestly, the Pulitzer worthy investigative reporting that people have done. It just is phenomenal. And sometimes journalists get a bad rap. But I think actually you can hold out so many examples of people who've done the Theranos case study, is amazing. Charles Duhigg, John Werd, chase down all the most wanted Nazi criminals and dedicate their lives to these cases. I think there are phenomenal examples, but you don't have to be a journalist, but you almost have to adopt a journalistic mindset, that Sherlock Holmes, without being paranoid, without being, because, to spend your life double,
never get anything
guessing
done.
everybody. But when it matters, Christian, you do. And when you're a leader, you kind of do, because as a leader, sycophantry is everywhere. You tell leaders the truth these days. People don't. Even, oh yes, I think remote working is fabulous. or, oh, let's all come back to the office. People aren't going to take that personal risk by telling the truth. Enter dumb spots, enter, our leaders really listening to what they're told, or are they hearing whatever it suits them to listen to? And in many cases, they're not filtering it. I mean, Liz Truss, you mentioned politicians. Liz Truss is an example of someone who completely tuned out. She tuned out the IMF. She tuned out everyone around her. Single-minded, tunnel vision, lots of different reasons fed into that. And she paid the price for that. Ironically, that the British people spoke and spoke loudly about her. But it's, as you say, it's absolutely everywhere. And it is what people are paid to do, in many cases. And I think leaders, people who hold power, have a huge responsibility. People don't realize the impact of their decisions, even if hiring somebody, something, approving a loan, how the price you give somebody buying a car who can't really afford the car. These kind of things you never forget. You never forget what people do for you or on you. And the decisions that people make, I think, and myself as a leader, once upon a time, I often forgot until I reminded myself, but you forget how important your words are to people and how they remember what you say and how you say it. And you become the conversation topic at someone's breakfast table if you get it wrong. So people holding positions of power in any shape, but someone who's giving you an upgrade in British Airways or American Airlines, they've got power in the moment. They have an impact. Their decisions have an impact, not high stakes. But when it comes to higher stakes, it does matter. And I think we're so busy, in that fast-paced world that we were talking about earlier. We just don't slow down enough to think that this decision really, really matters. Even think today, Christian, think after this call, what decision have you made or that someone else has made that has an impact on you? Did someone publish your article or not? Did someone, help you out in some way that you weren't expecting? When people make decisions that feel small to them, I think they underestimate the impact that it has on other people. And there is a responsibility there to get it right. There really, really is. High stakes, medium stakes. We can make the world a much better place if we even pause to think about it just a little bit. And I know we all don't. But maybe we can, and maybe we can do it just a little bit more.
I love that vision. And in the bulk of the book, you talk about, and there's a framework called the perimeters framework, which we're not going to go through because people should read about it in the book. But you talk about judgment traps, and there's a word that comes up quite a lot, which I love, which is roulette. And so you talk about decision roulette and recall roulette, and it comes up, and I really like the imagery of that because it I think we tend to think of the way that we tend to think of the way that we think. I'm going to repeat myself, but we tend to view our cognitive processes being logical and sensible. And I love the fact that you talked about roulette because what I liked about that was it wasn't saying it's always wrong. It was saying it can be right, but the odds are stacked against it unless you pay attention. So I thought that was a lovely image. Tell us a little bit about these traps and how they work, because that's the crux of what you're saying here is we need to understand, in order to be able to tune in, we need to recognize the traps that we could fall into.
Yeah. And well, to be honest, it's exactly right. I mean, I deliberately chose the word perimeters. I chose 10 traps, and they're situations in many respects. So, for example, and it stands for perimeters. There are 10. So, hunting power, P for power, ego, when you're assessing risk, braving identity, memory, forgetting memory, ignoring ethics, time, discounting time, uncalibrating your emotions. And we've talked about that. Your relationship with the crowd or internalizing stories. So they're the situations. When you're doing in any of those situations, you're vulnerable to 2 or 3 different biases. And that's what it is. I picked out 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 biases in each of those scenarios to illustrate when you can get it wrong. So the benefit of having these misjudgment traps, and there's a chapter devoted to each. So if you're feeling that you've got an ethical dilemma, for example, you can easily just go to the ethical trap one easily and look at what happens in those situations. So some of them are obvious, some of them could be with Holmes or the opioid crisis or McKinsey judgment call, but some of them can be, daily examples as well. What do you do? Are you at risk? And the perimeters basically says that you're at this point in time, your judgment is under threat. You are at risk of making a wrong judgment call, and you are. And if you think you're suffering any of these right now, it's time to pause, to put into effect some of these decision friction technique, because this is where you are most at risk. And they're easy to remember. It's easy to even just say to yourself, run through the PERMETERS in your mind and say, are any of these at play? Ego. Is this really just an ego call? Am I not doing this? Is this really just ego? And then you think, well, could it be, risk X, Y, and Z? Is it overconfidence? Is it self-belief? Am I suffering the illusion of invulnerability, the illusion of superiority? What is it that's at play here? And when you're able to label one of those things like the illusion of invulnerability, brilliant examples of the jogger who went running. A jogger went running in Canada's National Park where there were bears. Now, he's a local and he knows it. So he must have thought he was invulnerable, obviously, but he went running wearing earphones when the whole mandate was don't disturb the bears. So there are really obvious examples. It's not that we're going to be running through forests, on our daily run, I hope. But, we all metaphorically wear earphones all the time, and we do encounter bear traps of a sort in the office every day by who we're listening to. And sometimes it is ego. We think we're invulnerable. You think you'll never be sacked. You think you'll never be divorced. You think you'll never lose 20 pounds, go down the road. You think nothing bad is ever going to happen. You think you're never going to crash your car or your house is going to be burgled. And therefore you don't take precautions. So they're on a daily basis, but it's moving up the high stakes curve where these come into play. So the perimeters traps, there is a judgment. I mean, there will be a link on the website to a checklist that people can just look through these very easily. It's great if you're a consultant or advising clients, run through this list, use the checklist as a way to just safeguard some of these predictable, and that's, I think, is a key word, Christian, as we know. These are predictable errors because you repeat them and you're looking at either a lifetime of reward or regret on the basis of whether you actually choose to consciously take on board these unconscious traps.
And what I thought was interesting about it was there's enough stuff there where you could almost say, and this won't always be the case, hence is why I like the roulette thing. Sometimes you will strike, there won't be an issue, the decision will be great, but you could always just start from the premise of going, one of these will be at play. And if I just sat there and tried to work out which one it was, actually, sometimes I might surprise myself. And one of the things I found myself doing was, yes, I did the obvious thing of saying, of course, there are going to be situations, time is a really good example, where we all know when we're under massive amounts of time pressure, we haven't done something that we should have done, or we've been given a limited amount of time to do it. The decision making isn't necessarily great. And so we can recognize those when we think about it. But actually, I went through and just thought, if I wanted to review decisions I've made or I was thinking about, I just thought, don't sort of say none of these apply. Just assume that at least one will and try and work that out. And I found myself spotting situations where it wouldn't have been the first port of call, but actually it was relevant to the decision-making process and I should think about it. And so I viewed this a little bit like a sort of training regime where some of them I think I'm more familiar with and I can more easily recognize, particularly when I'm not necessarily in the moment, but certainly when I look back. But some of the other ones I thought, well, actually that's interesting. I haven't really focused on that before. And so I like this as a little bit of a regime. I viewed it a bit like sort of exercising all the parts of your body for fitness. I thought it was interesting to practice some of these things and think about them. So I really liked it as a sort of set of parameters or perimeters, maybe we should say, for thinking about those things. One of the things that I also liked about the book was you have at the end of each chapter, you have a sort of a box that's a helpful summary of things to think about, which one is useful for just dipping into if you want to think, but secondly, neatly pulls it all together. And you use the term decision ninja. And I like that because it made me smile, but I wanted to just unpick what is a decision ninja?
Well, do you know, I used it in my TED talk, which was about indecision. And I really liked it in my TED talk, TEDx talk. And I just thought, what else? You want to be a decision ninja, someone who is able to make decisions easier, more comfortably. And the truth is people really suffer with decision making. And it is difficult. It is difficult. Will I do A, B, not C, as opposed to broadening the traps? But people suffer from indecision. And I just like the idea that to become a decision ninja, somebody, you'll never get it all right. And we know that. And people will make mistakes. But I do think, and I did say it in the book, I did say that I do think there is a guarantee that if you at least are aware of these traps, you will make fewer mistakes than you will have made otherwise. And I firmly believe that. Because that awareness of how the mind thinks is a huge advantage in life. And people don't use it enough. Sometimes there's a little bit of intellectual snobbery. People think, either I'm so successful already, I don't need this. I really get people. I understand humans. Look how successful I am. Well, there are plenty of 70 and 80-year-olds who end up in prison too, for getting things wrong. So it's not a life stage or a success parameter, but I like the decision ninja is the person who gets it right comfortably and, I suppose gets more right than wrong. And I think and I think today you asked earlier on about education. Judgment is not taught, decision making is not taught. It is assumed, particularly around board tables. You reach that senior position, you've spent years climbing the ladder, and people think that you know how to do it. For example, I spoke to a big consultancy the other day, and I looked at their board program, not a word on judgment and decision making, every regulation, compliance, ethics, nothing on how to teach how to make better judgment and decision making. And that's something that actually is now going to be put into place because I highlighted and offered the suggestion that something might be something they want to
And there's a book that they
for.
could read to help them do that, of
Well,
course.
I never thought of that question, but guess what? There is. But there are probably plenty of books, to be fair. But companies aren't thinking like that, and companies they just don't think like that because it's a hard concept to grasp. What decision? We're not talking about what to buy in the supermarket. You're talking or small time decisions. Because you're talking about the important decisions. And as I said, because leaders have made so many good ones up the ladder, the other ones don't get into focus. But anyway, anyone can be a decision ninja if they want to be and they want to do better. So it is a nice phrase that people can maybe think about and form an identity, a better identity with.
But I love that. And you mentioned small decisions, like what you buy in the supermarket. But what I thought was also interesting was that if we want to be alive to this stuff, then we can practice it on smaller decisions so that we've got the muscle memory there for when it comes to the big one. Now, different scenario, but actually, one of the other things I was sort of thinking about was, actually, as I go through my daily, I can practice it with things where I don't even have to tell anyone, right? I can
Yeah.
just sort of think about what am I doing, a little bit like sort of you wouldn't start running a marathon straight away. And so I think one of the interesting things about decision making is that sometimes we kind of go, well, this is a big decision, buying a house, big decision. And then going food shopping, small decision. Correct. And of course, the consequences, providing you don't buy something that poisons you. Okay. The food decision is a short-term decision. It's not a bit. Whereas landing yourself with a property that's awful, locked into a mortgage you can't afford, there are longer-term consequences to that. So of course, one needs to be a bit more careful. But the mechanics of going into it are the same. And I think one of the things that's interesting when you talk about the board decision making is it's sort of like, well, we're senior people on the board. We have specialist skills because of our experience. But fundamentally, you're sitting there and being asked to do the same thing that you do when you go shopping in a supermarket. They probably don't go shopping in a supermarket, but same thing that you do in other contexts. And so I thought one of the things that really came through to me was yes, we think about the big decisions as being important, but why not practice it in the small moments and reflect on it in the small moments? Of course, walking into a supermarket isn't the same as sitting in the boardroom, but nonetheless, if we're much more alive to these dynamics and we've practiced them, then we're more likely in those bigger situations to be at least aware and have attuned ourselves to them. So I like this idea of it being a kind of useful gym. And so I would encourage people to think about it both on the small stuff, not because the small stuff matters massively, because it's a great opportunity to practice, stress test, and just get used to it so that when you have to deploy it when it really matters, you're prepared for it.
Do you know it's a brilliant point, Christian, and you're absolutely right. Every one of these can play to your grocery shopping. Ego, are you buying the big brand? Time, are you doing it under pressure? Ethics, well, am I buying the organically sourced ingredient, etc., etc., or stories? Well, the neighbor thinks this is great, and I saw the ads. Or it's an absolutely brilliant point because you can practice it on those smaller things, and then, as you say, when it comes to the more important ones, it becomes ingrained because it's an easy word. It's an easy word to run through, and it is about broadening your horizons. So yes, very, very good idea.
Love that. So before I let you go, just how has writing the book changed you? Because I'm always keen to hear from authors, because obviously we heard about the grounding for writing the book, the rationale behind it all makes perfect sense. But as you were going through the process, how has your decision making changed, or things that you do differently now as a result of looking at this subject in a lot of detail?
Well, I had a different answer to the first half than the second half of that question. So I'll answer both. The first one was, how did it change you? I learned a huge amount. I mean, with my first exposure to the publishing world, I learned a huge amount. I actually think that's a book in itself. I might do an article on what I learned about that. I learned something for myself that I found useful, Christian, and that is, and it might sound a bit odd. I think I'll never be bored from now on. Not that I ever was, let's face it. You know,
I can't
I
imagine
do
you
live
being
my life at
bored, but
500 miles an hour. I will never be bored. I will always have something to do. I could be, in terms of having an avenue. I could write forever now. Now, no one might read it, but I still might. But I could write forever now because there is so much out there. It is a constant source of stimulation, um, and enjoyment most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. And so I learned to myself, I will always have that. I mean, I remember I came from corporate life, 30 years, work, 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 work. This is different work. I might as well have written a PhD, quite frankly, in this book. So it was, other people do it a different way, but, you know, I did it that way, but I would write it differently the next time. So that was a positive that I sort of learned for myself. When I was working, I always thought, as in corporate life, I always thought you needed a big job, a big title. And I did. I mean, I spent my life climbing the ladder. But in the last couple of years, working for myself, sitting on different boards, doing this writing, I learned that actually there's a freedom. There is a freedom that you gain, at a certain point, when you don't need the title as much. And I don't. And I think that for me was a huge revelation in the book. And by the process, the course of writing the book. My sister asked me, why was I doing it, as I was, complaining, going, "Oh, it's too much," at one point when I was looking for things that I just couldn't get. And she said, why was I doing it? And it was a really good question. Like, you don't write a book for money, because no one makes anything up.
no,
Unless you're Oprah or,
or J.K. Rowling
J.K.
on book
Rowling.
number
You don't write
6,
a book.
right? Yeah.
You don't write a book for that. Do you write for vanity? Maybe a bit. But I actually thought, why do I actually want this? I actually wanted to leave a bit of my own little legacy. I have lots of, nieces and nephews who are now entering the consulting career, and they're climbing the ladder. And I thought, well, they never listen to you. Who listens to the auntie? Nobody. So then we sort of thought, well, do you know what? You may not listen to me, but you might read me. And so I didn't make a big play of it, and I didn't mention them once. But I do want them to learn. I do want them to avoid the traps. I've made mistakes. I didn't listen properly. I missed the signal. I was tone deaf too many times, as I'm sure my team and my leaders would lay testament to. But I wish I hadn't. But if I'd known to be aware of some of these things, Christian, I might have done things a little bit differently, and I might have smoothed the path, for me and for other people. And I just think, life can be easier. Life can be better. You can be happier. You can make fewer mistakes. And why not just take this knowledge on board? It's there. It exists. It's practically free. And I think the individual, the company, the society can be a much better place with it. So that's kind of what I got out of it. Did my decision making change, to your other question? I'm not sure my decision making changed. I think my analysis of how I make decisions changed, because now I do what you do. You're now practicing doing your shopping. I now do look at some choices, that my husband and I will be making, or that he would be making. A probably annoying habit I've made is to point out, oh, that's the X trap. Oh, do you know that's
Right.
X bias? Yeah, that's probably one I should probably curtail. So
I
that's
love
what
that.
I do.
Well, you in the preface of the book, you say that your marriage was the best decision you've ever made. I
Yeah.
would put the writing this book going to come fairly close behind that, in my opinion, Nuala, because I think it, not a statement on your marriage at all, but a statement on the quality of the book. It's a fantastic read, really thought provoking, really really interesting, and incredibly practical, which I love. And I genuinely enjoyed reading it as well, because often these books they tell you interesting things, but they're not written in a way that's readable. I devoured it, and I keep diving back into it. So I want to say, on behalf of myself and all the people that are going to read it, thank you for doing it. But so that they can do that, remind them of what it is called, and then we'll do the silly bit about and where can they find it.
Yes, it is called Tune In: How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World.
Amazing. There will be a link to that in the show notes for anybody that can't remember that and note that down, and comes highly recommended. Nuala, I've always enjoyed the conversations I've had with you whenever we've come across each other at various things. and look forward to more of that happening in future. But I've particularly enjoyed this one because I've learned a lot about you and the book and some of the things behind it. So thank you for all the things that you do. But above all, thank you for coming on the podcast and being an amazing guest.
Well, thank you, Christian, and thank you for reading the book. And actually, I've really enjoyed this. So thanks again. And, I really do appreciate you reading it and taking the time to do it. And your analysis and your insight into it has been tremendous. So I really do appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Nuala for appearing and to you for tuning in. To find out more about Nuala, her work, and her book, Tune In: How to Make Smarter Decisions in a Noisy World, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website at humanriskpodcast.com. If you've got any feedback, want to let me know what else you're doing while you're listening to the show, or just want to get in touch, please feel free to do so. I love hearing from my listeners. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Remember, it's your choice what you tune into, so choose wisely. And thank you so much for listening.